The health inspector showed up at my door with 2 police officers, a fire marshal, and a clipboard that looked like it could double as a weapon. I was in my backyard, flipping ribs on my smoker when they arrived, mid-service with 5 paying customers waiting on brisket and a peach cobbler still warming in the outdoor oven. The inspector said with an official tone that he'd received a complaint about me operating a commercial business in a residential zone. The complaint had been filed by Margaret Susan Blackwell, our HOA president and self-appointed neighborhood dictator, who considered the smoke from my grill to be aesthetic pollution and my barbecue sauce, in her words, too bold for the refined palates of Silverstone Gardens. She had no idea who she was messing with. My name is David Garrett, and I'm a former Marine turned remote software developer with a passion for smoking meat that borders on religious devotion. When I moved to Silverstone Gardens 3 years ago, I thought I'd found the perfect quiet suburb to settle down in. The HOA seemed like a minor annoyance at worst, something I could ignore while I enjoyed my spacious backyard and the freedom to work from home. When my company went fully remote, I had more time on my hands, and what started as weekend barbecues for friends gradually evolved into something more. I called it Garrett's Smokehouse, though it wasn't really a business in any formal sense. Just word-of-mouth orders from neighbors and friends who couldn't resist the pull of authentic Texas-style brisket that had been smoking for 14 hours straight. No signs out front, no advertising, no drive-through window. Just me, my custom-built smoker, and meat so tender it practically fell apart when you looked at it. On good weekends, I might serve 20 or 30 people, all picking up orders from my backyard like it was the world's most exclusive pop-up restaurant. That's when Margaret Susan Blackwell entered the picture. She lived 3 houses down and had been HOA president for 7 years running, mostly because nobody else wanted the job badly enough to challenge her. Margaret was the type of person who measured grass height with a ruler and sent violation notices if your mailbox was the wrong shade of black. She ran the HOA like her personal kingdom, and she did not appreciate the smell of hickory smoke drifting into her pristine backyard during her Saturday morning yoga sessions. It started with passive-aggressive notes in my mailbox. She expressed concerns about increased foot traffic in the neighborhood. Then came a formal warning about unauthorized gatherings on HOA property, which was ridiculous since it was my own backyard. The third letter included a photograph of a perfectly smoked pork rib with the words, "Is this zoning compliant?" scrawled across it in red marker. I should have known then that she was documenting everything, building her case like a prosecutor preparing for trial. The fines started rolling in next. $100 for commercial signage, which turned out to be the chalkboard menu I kept inside my garage. $200 for creating food-related odors that violated the HOA's ambient standards. $350 for conducting unauthorized commerce on HOA-regulated property. I appealed every single fine through the proper channels, and I actually won the first 2 appeals because even the other board members thought Margaret was being ridiculous. But then she called an emergency meeting and somehow pushed through amendments to the bylaws that specifically targeted outdoor cooking for profit. She started flying a drone over my backyard during peak smoking hours, taking photos and videos of every customer who came by. She filed complaints with the health department, the fire department, and even animal control, claiming my barbecue was attracting dangerous wildlife. One of my regular customers, a lawyer named Patricia, told me Margaret had been going door to door, trying to build a coalition against what she called my underground meat syndicate. Most of the neighbors just laughed at her, especially the ones who'd tasted my burnt ends, but Margaret was nothing if not persistent. The situation escalated when she somehow convinced 2 other board members that I was operating an illegal restaurant that was bringing down property values. She presented a 40-page report at the next HOA meeting, complete with charts showing smoke dispersion patterns and theoretical property depreciation models. I attended that meeting with a tray of my signature jalapeno mac and cheese, which I strategically placed near the podium. Half the board members were sneaking bites while Margaret ranted about commercial kitchen regulations and the sanctity of residential zoning. Then came the day she called the police. I was in the middle of pulling a 12-pound brisket off the smoker when I saw the convoy of official vehicles pull up to my house. 2 police officers, the health inspector, and the fire marshal all looked supremely uncomfortable as they stood in my driveway. One of the officers, a young guy who couldn't have been more than 25, kept eyeing the smoker with obvious interest. The health inspector, though, was all business. He had a printed complaint from Margaret listing violations that ranged from the legitimate sounding to the absolutely absurd. According to her complaint, I was guilty of unregulated meat sales, creating a fire hazard with my flammable hickory behavior, and producing unauthorized peach-based desserts that hadn't been approved by the State Food Safety Board. The fire marshal took one look at my setup and started laughing. My smoker was positioned exactly where code required, with proper clearance from any structures and a commercial-grade fire suppressor within arm's reach. The health inspector asked to see my permits, clearly expecting me not to have any. That's when I pulled out my folder. Cottage food operator license from the state, check. Smoke compliance waiver from the city, check. A backyard zoning exemption that I'd gotten from the city council 6 months earlier when I saw where this was heading, check. Even a food handler certification and liability insurance, just to cover all my bases. The inspector flipped through the documents with increasing surprise. Everything was perfectly legal and above board. I'd done my homework, researched every regulation, and made sure I was operating completely within the law. One of the police officers, the older one who'd been quiet until then, finally spoke up. He said this seemed like a waste of everyone's time and suggested that this was really an HOA matter, not a criminal one. I offered them all some brisket to go, which they politely declined due to policy, though I caught the younger officer looking back longingly as they left. The health inspector handed me his card and said to call if I had any more trouble, adding with a slight smile that my setup was one of the cleanest he'd seen. Margaret was standing in her driveway watching the whole thing, and when the official vehicles pulled away without shutting me down, her face turned a shade of purple I'd previously only achieved with my signature blackberry barbecue sauce. That night, I found a note taped to my smoker that read, "This ends now. I know where your firewood supplier lives." That was when I knew I had to take serious action. Threatening my wood supplier was threatening my entire operation, and I wasn't about to let some power-hungry HOA president intimidate me or my business associates. I hired Patricia, the lawyer who was also one of my best customers, and we filed a lawsuit against both Margaret personally and the entire HOA board. The charges included harassment, defamation of character, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of my rights as a small business owner. Patricia was particularly excited about the case because she'd been waiting for someone to finally stand up to Margaret's reign of terror. We requested full discovery, which meant Margaret and the HOA would have to turn over all their records related to my case. The discovery phase was absolutely beautiful. Margaret had been meticulous in her record-keeping, which worked against her spectacularly. We found receipts showing she'd used HOA funds to pay for her surveillance drone, multiple legal consultations specifically about neighborhood grill containment strategies, and even a template for cease and desist letters that she'd labeled pork offenders in her files. There were emails to other board members with subject lines like Operation Charcoal, How to Smoke Out Garrett Legally, and Emergency, Brisket Situation Escalating. The most damaging evidence was a series of emails between Margaret and her sister, where she admitted that she didn't actually have any legal grounds to shut me down but was determined to make my life so miserable that I'd stop on my own. She'd written, and I quote, "If I have to smell hickory smoke one more Saturday morning, I'm going to lose my mind. This neighborhood was perfect before that meat-obsessed jarhead moved in." Patricia practically danced when she read that email, knowing it showed clear discriminatory intent and personal bias. We also discovered that Margaret had been misleading the other board members about the actual number of complaints. She'd been filing multiple complaints herself under slight variations of her name and counting each one as a separate neighbor complaint. Out of the supposed 37 complaints about my barbecue operation, 34 had come from Margaret, her husband Roger, and her adult daughter who didn't even live in the neighborhood. The other 3 complaints were about the smell, and 2 of those neighbors had since become regular customers. The court date arrived on a beautiful Thursday morning in October. Margaret showed up with her own lawyer, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit who kept shuffling his papers and clearing his throat. Patricia came prepared with a presentation she'd titled Smoke and Freedom, a Defense of Backyard Barbecue Rights. She methodically laid out our case, showing how Margaret had abused her position, misused HOA funds, and conducted a personal vendetta disguised as official HOA business. The judge, an older woman named Roberta Harrison, seemed increasingly annoyed as the evidence mounted. When Margaret's lawyer tried to argue that I was destroying the cultural identity of the neighborhood, Judge Harrison actually laughed out loud. Patricia then played our ace card, a video from Margaret's own Facebook page, posted just 2 months before her complaint campaign began, showing her at my backyard eating ribs and telling the camera that it was the best barbecue she'd ever had. The timestamp showed it was from the neighborhood 4th of July party I'd hosted. Margaret tried to claim she'd only eaten the food to gather evidence, but the video clearly showed her going back for seconds and thirds, even asking me for my sauce recipe. Her lawyer put his head in his hands when Patricia showed an email Margaret had sent the next day, thanking me for the wonderful food and asking if I could cater her book club meeting. That request, Patricia pointed out, proved Margaret knew about my food service and had no problem with it until some unknown event triggered her campaign 2 months later. The unknown event, as it turned out, was Margaret discovering that I'd been asked to cater the HOA's annual summer picnic instead of her sister-in-law's catering company, which had done it for the past 5 years. This information came out when Margaret was on the stand and got flustered under Patricia's questioning. She admitted with barely contained rage that she couldn't stand the idea of my backyard operation getting the recognition she felt it didn't deserve, especially when her family members could have used the business. Judge Harrison had heard enough. She ruled completely in my favor on all counts. Margaret was found personally liable for harassment and defamation, with damages set at $25,000. The HOA was ordered to pay all my legal fees, which came to another $15,000, and to issue a formal public apology in the neighborhood newsletter. I was granted a permanent exemption from all HOA restrictions related to my backyard cooking, as long as I maintained my proper city and state permits. But the best part came when Judge Harrison addressed Margaret directly. She said that in her 30 years on the bench, she'd rarely seen such a clear case of abuse of power and personal vendetta masquerading as official conduct. She recommended that the HOA board review their bylaws and consider term limits for board positions. The judge also noted that if any further harassment occurred, she would consider criminal charges. Margaret's face went from purple to white to a sort of greenish color I'd never seen on a human before. The aftermath was swift and brutal for Margaret. An emergency HOA meeting was called that very evening, and by a vote of 47-3, she was removed from her position as president and banned from holding any HOA office for life. The only 3 votes in her favor came from her husband Roger and 2 board members who hadn't attended the trial. When the results were announced, Margaret stood up, knocked over her chair, and declared that we'd all regret this when property values plummeted and the neighborhood became nothing but smoke and chaos. Then she stormed out, slamming the door so hard that the glass cracked.